Ilara Finch kept a salvage yard on the last strip of land before the sea began to argue with the sky. Gravesend Spit was a place of salt-stained windows and quiet debts, a place that pretended storms were ordinary because fear was expensive. On clear mornings, gulls rode the wind like scraps of paper. On bad mornings, the fog came in thick and yellowed, and the water in the harbor looked like bruised glass. Ilara learned early that the ocean did not punish people for being wrong, only for being slow. Her father had been slow once. One winter when the tide rose higher than the notices said it would. His boat returned without him, and the town offered sympathy the way it offered everything else. Carefully measured, never enough, always with strings. By 30, Ilara had stopped waiting for anyone to untie those knots. She rebuilt broken things for a living: propellers, generators, rusted stoves pulled from drowned basements, and she rebuilt herself the same way, piece by stubborn piece. The salvage yard sat behind a crooked fence of driftwood boards. Inside, there were piles of metal shaped like wrecked animals, nets, chain, coils of wire, and a shack with a radio set that hissed all night, even when no one spoke into it. The radio was her one indulgence, a battered marine unit she'd rewired until it sang. She used it to track boats, to listen for emergency calls, to catch distant weather reports that never quite matched what the sea delivered. On the afternoon Noah arrived. The tide was too low and the air smelled like hot iron. A cargo barge had grounded on the outer shoal, and the harbor master had sent crews to drag it free. Ilara watched through binoculars, as men in bright jackets moved like ants along the hull. Then her radio crackled, not with the usual staticky chatter, but with a voice that sounded like it had traveled through a hallway of mirrors. "Bulletin," the voice said, clipped and metallic. "Fire at Gravesend," Spit reported at 3:12. "Cause unknown. Multiple injuries. Witnesses describe a boy with a blue scarf." Ilara froze, wrench in hand. She looked down at her neck. A strip of blue cloth, her mother's old scarf, was knotted there to keep her hair back. The radio hissed again, then went silent, as if it had never spoken. She waited for another call, another clue, but the set returned to its usual ocean-breathing static. The barge was still stuck. The men were still straining at ropes. Nothing burned. Nothing screamed. She told herself it had been interference, a broken transistor, her own tired brain filling gaps. Yet her skin stayed tight, as if she had swallowed a wire. At dusk, when the crews finally dragged the barge free, something else drifted into her yard with the slackening current. A shipping container, half submerged, its paint scoured to gray. It scraped against the rocks and settled near her jetty like a beached whale. Containers washed in sometimes after storms, but this one had no storm behind it, only the peculiar low tide and the day's heat. Ilara should have called the harbor office. She should have left it for the authorities. Instead, she took her crowbar and climbed down to the waterline, boots slipping on algae. The container's doors were chained shut with a padlock that looked too new. A faint tapping came from inside, not the clunk of shifting cargo, but a small, rhythmic sound, like fingernails on metal. Ilara's throat went dry. She leaned close. "Hello?" she called. The tapping stopped, then a whisper, barely audible through steel. "Please." The word was scraped raw, as if it had been practiced and punished. Ilara bent to the padlock. It wasn't a harbor seal. It was a private lock, the kind used to keep people out. Her hands moved before her thoughts could organize. Crowbar against chain, weight and leverage, metal screaming. The lock snapped, and the doors lurched open with a sigh of trapped air. The smell that poured out was of damp cardboard, diesel, and fear. In the dim interior, amid bundled tarps and plastic-wrapped crates, a child sat with knees to chest. He could not have been more than 8. His hair was dark and matted with salt. His wrists showed red bands where rope had rubbed skin. He wore a jacket 2 sizes too big and clutched a blue scarf so tightly its fringe cut into his fingers. His eyes lifted to Ilara with the wary precision of someone who had learned that kindness could change shape without warning. "What's your name?" Ilara asked. The boy swallowed. "Noah," he said after a long second. "Noah Vale." The last name sounded like a choice, not an inheritance. Ilara stepped back and offered her hand anyway. "Palm up, empty. You're safe here," she said, and she hated how unsure her voice sounded, as if she were negotiating with the world. Noah did not take her hand. He scooted forward, staying close to the wall, and slipped past her like a cat escaping a cage, landing on the rocks with careful feet. He stared at the sea as though expecting it to speak. "They said I'd sink," he murmured. Alara frowned. Who said that? Noah blinked, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he nodded at the air, the empty space between her shack and the tide line. The words, he murmured, the words that show up. Alara's stomach clenched. She remembered the radio's bulletin, the boy with the blue scarf. She looked at the scarf in Noah's hands. It was the same kind of blue as her mother's, but not the same fabric. Still, the color felt like a warning. Come inside, she said, forcing steadiness. We'll get you warm, and then we'll figure out what happened. She guided him toward the shack, where the radio sat on a shelf and the kettle always waited. Noah hesitated at the door, eyes scanning for traps. Alara set the kettle on the burner and lit the flame. The small act of making tea, of creating heat on purpose, felt like rebellion. While the water warmed, she rummaged through a trunk for clean clothes. Noah watched every move, silent but alert, as if cataloging her habits for later survival. When she returned with a sweater and a towel, he flinched at the towel's sudden movement. Alara paused and lowered it slowly. No rush, she said. Nothing's going to happen fast here unless you want it to. Noah's shoulders loosened a fraction. He took the sweater and pulled it on, the sleeves swallowing his hands. He kept the scarf. When the tea was ready, Alara poured 2 mugs and slid one across the table. Noah sniffed it suspiciously, then sipped. The warmth seemed to surprise him. His eyes watered, and he blinked hard as if refusing to let the water fall. Alara sat across from him and waited, not pressing, letting the silence become a door he could open. After several minutes, Noah spoke in a flat, careful tone. They picked me up on the road, he said. A white van. They said they were taking me to my aunt. I don't have an aunt. I told them that. They laughed. His fingers tightened around the mug. They tied me inside the container. They said the sea would wash me away, and then no one would have to talk about me. Alara felt anger bloom behind her ribs, bright as a flare. Who are they? She asked. Noah shook his head. I didn't see faces. Just hands. One had a ring shaped like an anchor. He lifted his own wrist, showing the rope burns. I tried to count days by the light, but there was only a crack. Sometimes I heard the radio on their boat. Sometimes I heard someone reading messages out loud, like they were watching something. They kept saying, "This is how the villain is made." Alara's scalp prickled. The language was wrong for kidnappers, wrong for fishermen. It sounded like spectators. Noah, she said gently. Did you see any messages? Noah nodded without looking up. Yes, he whispered. They appear. Like captions. Like someone is writing on the air. Sometimes they say what will happen. Sometimes they cheer. Sometimes they argue. When they showed up, the men got angry. They said the words were feeding me ideas. Alara swallowed. She wanted to tell him that wasn't possible. That air could not hold letters. That radios did not broadcast the future. But she had heard that bulletin. She had heard a voice that described what hadn't happened yet, with a certainty that made her bones ring. Where are you from? She asked, choosing a path she could walk. Not here, Noah said. I was on the mainland, in foster places. I ran away. I slept in train stations. I thought the ocean would be safer. He gave a humorless half smile. The ocean doesn't know my name. Alara reached for her phone. No signal. Gravesend Spit was stingy with connection. She could drive to the ridge and get a bar. But she didn't want to leave him alone. She also didn't want to bring the harbor police here without understanding what she'd opened. Containers belonged to someone. Someone would come looking. She stood and checked the lock on the shack's door. A habit she had never needed before. When she returned, Noah was staring at the radio. That thing talks, he said. Alara followed his gaze. The radio's green light pulsed. Static rolled like distant surf. It talks to everyone, she said. Noah gave a small shake of his head. Not like this, he pointed. The dial's needle trembled as if in a draft. Then, with no button pressed, a thin voice slid out. Update, it said. Search underway for missing minor. Local resident advised to keep distance. The boy's name is Noah Vale. Repeat, Noah Vale. If he is sheltered, the harbor will burn. Alara's mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, tea spreading like a stain. Noah did not move. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were older than his face. See? He murmured. It does that. Alara crouched to pick up shards, mostly so she would have something to do with her hands. Her mind raced through options and consequences. Call the authorities and risk handing him back to the people who chained him. Hide him and risk the fire the radio insisted would come. Leave town entirely and risk the ocean on the road. She looked up at Noah. The blue scarf was wrapped twice around his neck like a tether. "Listen," she said, voice low, firm the way she spoke to engines that refused to start. "We are not going to let anyone burn anything. We are going to find who put you in that container. And we are going to make sure you never go back." Noah watched her, measuring. "People always say that," he said. "Then they get tired." Alara stood. "I don't get tired," she said, and for once she believed it. The shack smelled of diesel and pine sap, a mix that had seeped into the boards over years of wet boots and repaired nets. Alara set a kettle on the small stove and watched Noah like she watched the horizon, without blinking when it mattered. He hovered near the door, shoulders tight, as if the room were a trap. "Sit," she said gently, tapping the only chair. He stayed standing until the kettle began to hiss, then sank onto the edge as though the wood might bite. Alara wrapped a blanket around him and offered a mug of sweet tea. He drank with the speed of someone who expected the cup to be stolen. When his hands stopped shaking, she lifted the blue scarf. "Where did you get this?" Noah's eyes tracked the cloth. "It was in the box," he said. The metal box. He meant the shipping container that had washed onto the outer sandbar the night before. Alara had seen it at dawn, half buried like a beached whale, its side dented and painted with a company logo she didn't recognize, a black trident inside a circle. By noon, men from the port had dragged it back toward the docks with a winch and a lot of swearing. By evening, the harbor office had posted a polite notice: "Lost cargo. Do not approach." Alara had ignored it, as she ignored most notices in Gravesend, because the notices never carried bread. "You were inside?" she asked. Noah nodded once, then glanced at the radio on the shelf. Alara followed his gaze and felt the old, uneasy prickle. The radio was a stubborn thing, a battered receiver her father had used when he ran a skiff for the Coast Guard. It crackled even on calm days, as if it remembered danger. She had turned it on at sunrise out of habit, expecting weather reports. Instead, she had heard a voice reading headlines in a flat, distant cadence. "Emergency advisory. Evacuation. Recommended for Gravesend Spit. Cause. Chemical fire following storm surge. Missing. 11. Suspected cause. Illegal dump site breached." The bulletin had ended with a name she didn't know, spoken like an accusation. Vale. Then the line had gone dead, leaving only the sound of static, like sand in teeth. Now Noah sat in her chair, and his surname had just entered her life as if it had been waiting in the fog. Alara didn't believe in fate, but she believed in patterns. "Why were you in the container?" she asked. Noah looked down at his knees. A thin scar curved along his wrist, half-healed. "Because they said it was safer," he said. "Who is they?" Alara pressed. He hesitated, then whispered, "The men with the trident." Alara took a breath and forced her voice to stay even. "Noah, you're not in trouble here. Tell me what you can." He gave her a quick, wary look, then spoke in short pieces, like someone handing over fragile glass. He had been living in the old cannery building at the edge of town, the one that everyone pretended was empty. The port boss, Captain Rusk, used it as storage for things that didn't belong in daylight. Sometimes kids snuck in to steal copper or sleep away from loud houses. Noah had been one of those kids, though he didn't say it like a confession. He said it like weather. He had known a man named Harker who wore a Trident pin and smelled of antiseptic. Harker promised work, food, a ride to the mainland. "He said I was smart," Noah said, voice small. He said, "Smart kids get picked." Then, last night, the cannery had filled with men in crates, and the air had stung like bleach. Noah had hidden behind a stack of empty barrels when the shouting started. He heard the word storm and the word inventory and, once, his own name. "They didn't want me seen," he said. "So they put me where the paperwork couldn't find me." Alara's jaw tightened. She knew Captain Rusk. Everyone did. Rusk owned the tugboats, the cranes, the warehouse keys. He also owned the quiet in Gravesend, the way people swallowed questions because their paychecks tasted like fear. "Why did the container wash out?" she asked. Noah's fingers worried the fringe of the scarf. "Because the gate broke," he said. "I heard metal screaming, then water, then I couldn't breathe." He said it the way people describe dreams. Alara stood and opened the back window. The tide was moving in, thick and gray. Far out, a line of fog lay flat as a blade. She didn't like the way the world looked, like it was holding its breath. The kettle clicked off. Alara poured more tea, then set the mug aside and reached for the radio. She turned the knob slowly. Static, then a surge of sound, and the same distant voice returned, clearer than before. "Correction to prior advisory," it said. "Cause: ignition source under investigation. Witness report: a child removed from container at 5:41. Name unconfirmed." Alara's skin went cold. She stared at the radio as if it were a mouth she didn't recognize. Noah's head snapped up. "It's doing it again," he whispered. The words. Alara set the radio down with shaking hands. "That broadcast is not real," she said, though she didn't know who she was trying to convince. "It can't be." Noah swallowed. "It happens near me," he said. "When I'm close. Things flicker." He lifted his hand and pointed at the empty air above the table. Alara saw nothing at first. Then, as if her eyes adjusted, faint letters shimmered, pale as fish scales in moonlight. Not words she heard, but words she saw, hovering in a thin, trembling line. "He's the spark. If she keeps him, the town burns. If she leaves him, he burns alone." Alara's breath snagged. The letters vanished, then reappeared, rearranged like restless birds. "Choose the fire you can live with." She backed away until she hit the wall. Her mind searched for explanation, the way her hands searched for a tool. Poison, fatigue, grief, but Noah was watching the air with a familiar dread, as if he had seen this script more times than he could count. "They follow you," Alara said. Noah nodded without pride. "They follow the storm," he corrected. Alara looked at the radio, the fog, the boy in her chair, and felt the edges of her ordinary life begin to fray. Outside, a gull screamed, long and sharp. Alara made a decision the way she tied knots. Quickly, before doubt loosened the rope. "You stay here tonight," she said, "in the loft, away from the windows." Noah's shoulders dropped by a fraction. "And tomorrow?" he asked. Alara forced a smile that felt like holding a door shut against wind. "Tomorrow," she said, "we find out what Rusk put in that container and why the sea tried to deliver it to me." In the morning, the fog thinned to a milky veil, and the spit looked less like the end of the world and more like an apology the land offered the sea. Noah followed Alara around the yard, silent but alert, cataloging every sound. The creak of chain, the crack of driftwood underfoot, the distant thud of a crane at Rusk's docks across the bay. She gave him tasks that could not fail: hold the flashlight, sort washers by size, count the plastic jugs she kept for rainwater, then watched his hands begin to move with something like relief. People underestimated the comfort of instructions. She had survived her own childhood by doing exactly what needed doing, even when nobody thanked her for it. At mid-morning, she walked him into town. Graves and Spit had one road and one grocery store, and a bar that served coffee until noon and regret after. Men on the pier paused with their nets half lifted. Women at the post office stopped mid-stamp. Alara felt their eyes like wet sand on her skin. They knew her as the salvage woman, the one who could pull a working engine out of a drowned boat, the one who didn't owe anyone favors because she paid in sweat. Now she carried a boy with a bruised dark past and a scarf the wrong shade of blue, and the town's curiosity sharpened into something hungry. At the grocery, the cashier, Lainey Morvain, leaned forward and whispered, "Is that Rusk's?" Noah stiffened. Alara kept her voice even. "He's nobody's," she said. "He's with me." Lainey's gaze flicked to Noah, then down to his hands. "There was a container offloaded last night," she murmured, so low the aisle of canned beans swallowed the words. "No manifest. No customs." The harbor light kept blinking like it was sick. Alara's stomach tightened. "You saw it?" "My cousin works the crane," Lainey said. "He won't talk, but he drinks when he can't sleep. He said the box was marked with a hazard code he'd never seen." She swallowed. "Alara, you've got a storm glass in your yard and you don't even know it." Outside, wind tugged at the paper flyers nailed to poles. One of them, half torn, advertised a new community watch meeting. Another bore Rusk Maritime's logo in glossy ink, with a promise of jobs and expansion. Alara watched Noah read the letters without moving his lips, as if every word might be dangerous. Back in the shack, the radio crackled without anyone touching it. A thin female voice bled through the static, clipped like a broadcast anchor, though the signal came from nowhere Alara knew. "Breaking. Spill response delayed as private security blocks access to the South Channel. The voice paused, then continued, colder. 2 missing. 1 juvenile. Alara's hand froze around the mug she'd been lifting. Noah's eyes went wide, not with surprise, but recognition. It's starting, he said. It always starts with the woman who talks like a knife. Alara turned the dial. The frequency drifted, the voice smearing into a whistle. Then the radio snapped back, and a different sound poured out. A burst of laughter, a siren in the distance, and a man shouting, "Don't let them film this." Alara yanked the plug from the wall. The radio kept talking for 3 heartbeats, then died. She stared at the dead set as if it had just shown teeth. "That isn't possible," she said, though she'd learned years ago that impossible was just a label people used when they ran out of explanations. Noah hugged the blanket tighter. "The words and the voices," he whispered. "They're like someone watching from far away, but also like someone warning you. Sometimes they lie, sometimes they're right." Alara thought of the sea delivering the boy and the container like a paired message. She thought of the way the town had trained itself to look away from Rusk's fences, from his black boats that never listed their cargo, from the workers who suddenly had money and then suddenly were gone. She had stayed out of it because staying out was how you stayed alive. But the radio had said juvenile, and Noah had flinched as though he'd already heard his own obituary. "Listen," she said, keeping her voice steady even as her pulse climbed. "Whatever this is, we're not going to let it write your life for you." Noah stared at her. "People say that," he repeated, softer than before. Alara opened the drawer under the table and pulled out a battered notebook she used for parts lists. She tore a page free and wrote in large letters. South Channel, hazard box, security, juvenile. She shoved the page toward him. "When you feel the words," she said, "tell me what they say. Not later, right away." He hesitated, then nodded once, a small, reluctant agreement. That afternoon, Alara drove her truck along the ridge road above the harbor, keeping the boy low in the passenger seat so fewer eyes could take inventory of him. From the overlook, she could see Rusk's docks, a neat geometry of cranes, stacks, and floodlights that made the water below look like a stage. A black container sat near the far warehouse, half hidden behind a wall of shipping pallets. Men in gray jackets moved around it with the stiff coordination of hired muscle. A white pickup idled nearby with tinted windows. Alara's jaw tightened. She had fixed engines for fishermen who hated Rusk, and for dockhands who worked for him because their children needed shoes. She did not hate easily. She saved hate for people who earned it. She handed Noah a pair of binoculars. "Can you count?" He put them to his eyes. 12, he said. 2 at the gate, 4 near the box. The others, they're watching the water. "Why would they watch the water?" Alara muttered. Noah lowered the binoculars. His pupils looked too big, as if the light had hurt them. "Because they're afraid something will wash up," he said. Alara drove down the hill and parked behind the bait shed. The air near the dock smelled wrong, like metal soaked in vinegar. She walked with purpose, the way you walked when you belonged somewhere, even if you didn't. A guard stepped into her path, hand resting on his belt. "Private property," he said. Alara lifted her chin. "I'm here to buy scrap," she replied, holding up an old business card she'd once received from a foreman. "Your boss owes me 2 engines. The guard looked her over, calculating. Behind his shoulder, the warehouse door stood cracked open, and Alara caught a glimpse of a plastic-wrapped drum with a bright orange label. A symbol like a twisted fishbone sat inside a triangle. Noah, behind her, made a small choking sound. Alara didn't turn, but she felt his fear rise like cold water. "Engines get logged," the guard said. "Go to the office." Alara smiled, slow and harmless. "Sure," she said, and kept walking as if she'd been invited. A second guard stepped closer, blocking her from the cracked door. Alara stopped 2 paces from him and let her gaze slide past, as if she were bored. "Funny thing," she said casually, "about containers that don't have manifests. Sometimes the Coast Guard gets curious." The man's posture tightened. "You're not Coast Guard." "No," Alara agreed. "But I know their radio channels." She watched the man's eyes flick to the truck where Noah waited, unseen. "And I know when a storm is coming." The guard's jaw worked. He did not move, but his hand shifted, thumb brushing something beneath his jacket. Alara took 1 step back, the message clear. "Leave." She left, not because she was afraid of a fist fight, but because fists weren't what kept people silent in Gravesend Spit. Paperwork did. Threats did. Accidents did. In the truck, Noah's hands trembled in his lap. "The words," he said. "They're here." Alara's throat tightened. "Tell me." Noah stared at the dashboard as if the air above it were a screen. "They say, glass-tied. They say, he thinks you won't look under the floor." Alara's scalp prickled. "Under whose floor?" Noah blinked hard. "The warehouse," he said. "Or your shack. I can't tell. The words, they're smudged." Alara's mind ran through her shack. The radio shelf, the stove, the loose floorboard near the door where she kept her father's old compass. And, sometimes, cash. She'd never hidden anything illegal, but she had hidden plenty of things from the town. Her grief, her fear, her loneliness. She drove home with both hands locked on the wheel. At the shack, she dropped to her knees and pried up the loose plank. Beneath it, in a shallow cavity, lay not only her compass, but a small, sealed envelope she had never seen. The paper was dry and crisp, as if it had been placed there yesterday, yet dust clung to it as though it belonged to the house. A name was written across the front in careful block letters. Alara Finch. She glanced at Noah. "Did you do this?" He shook his head, eyes huge. Alara tore it open. Inside was a memory card in a plastic sleeve, and a note that read, in plain ink, "If you hear the bulletins, you're already in it. Show this to someone who has a badge and a backbone. Do not trust the mayor." Alara's pulse thudded. The mayor was Rusk's cousin. Of course. She looked at the memory card as if it might burn her fingers. "Where did this come from?" she whispered. Noah swallowed. "The sea gives things back," he said. "Sometimes it gives them to the wrong people, sometimes to the right one." Alara forced air into her lungs. "Then we make sure it's the right one," she said. That night she didn't sleep. She sat at the table with the radio unplugged, the memory card in front of her, and the storm glass on the shelf ticking softly as bubbles rose and fell. She borrowed Lenny's old laptop, the one with a cracked hinge, and slid the card into the side. A folder opened, filled with video clips and spreadsheets. The first clip showed a man in a hard hat filming inside the warehouse. Drums, leaking seams, a forklift with rusted tines pushing pallets too fast. Then a close-up of the fishbone symbol. A voice whispered off camera. "They told us it was cleaning solvent. It's not. It's something that eats skin." Alara's stomach lurched. The next file was a list of dates, tide charts, weather predictions, and beside them, short codes that looked like radio frequencies. Noah leaned close, eyes narrowed. "That's the channel," he said. "That's the voice." Alara scrolled. A final document bore a single line, glass tide event probability, 0.71. Primary trigger, container breach during storm surge. Secondary trigger, sabotage to floodgates. Alara sat back hard enough that the chair legs scraped the floor. "Someone planned this," she said. Noah's voice was small. "Someone planned me, too," he said. Alara looked at him then, really looked. The boy's face was sharp-boned and young, but the exhaustion in his eyes belonged to someone much older. He had been living inside a story written by other hands. Alara understood that kind of captivity. She closed the laptop. "Tomorrow," she said, "we find a badge and a backbone, and if the town won't help us, we'll make enough noise that the sea itself can't drown it." Noah hesitated, then reached for the blue scarf and tied it around his neck like armor. "If we make noise," he asked, "do you think the words will stop?" Alara stared out at the dark water, where the harbor lights blinked like nervous eyes. "I don't know," she said. "But if they don't stop, we'll use them. We'll turn the watching into witnesses." Alara's plan began with the only person in Gravesend Spit who wore a uniform that did not answer to Rusk. Deputy Maris Calder, a woman who had transferred from inland after a divorce and never quite learned the town's unspoken rules. Maris lived in a small apartment above the bait shop, where the walls were thin enough to hear the freezer hum through the floor. She opened her door with her service pistol low but ready, then relaxed when she saw Alara. "Please tell me you're not bringing me another engine dispute," Maris said. "Worse," Alara replied, and stepped inside before fear could talk her out of it. She set the laptop on the kitchen table, slid the memory card into place, and played the warehouse video without preamble. The harsh fluorescent light in the clip turned the drums into glossy insects. The camera zoomed on the fishbone symbol. Maris's face drained of color. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "The sea put it under my floor," Alara said, "and a boy washed up with it." At the word boy, Maris's gaze flicked to Noah, who stood in the doorway like a shadow that had learned to breathe. Maris's expression softened, then tightened again as the last clip played. A man in a gray jacket cutting a padlock off a floodgate control box at the South Channel. "That's sabotage," Maris said, "and that's federal water." Alara leaned in. "Can you call the Coast Guard?" Maris hesitated. "I can," she said slowly. "But the mayor will hear about it, and then Rusk will hear about it, and then—" Her voice trailed off in a practiced awareness of consequences. Noah spoke up, quiet but clear. "Then the juvenile goes missing," he said, eyes fixed on Maris. "That's what the bulletin said." Maris stared at him. "What bulletin?" Alara told her about the radio, about the voice that arrived like weather, about the phrases that cut through static and set the future on the table. Maris listened with the look of someone deciding whether to believe a witness or diagnose a symptom. When Alara finished, Maris rubbed her temples. "I've heard stranger things in this town," she said finally. "I'll make the call. But I'm not doing it from my phone." They drove to the edge of the spit, where the old coast station sat abandoned, its antenna bent like a broken finger. Maris still had a key because she handled nuisance reports there when the main office was being renovated, which was always. Inside, dust coated the desks, but the radio console looked intact. Maris powered it up and spoke into the microphone with crisp authority. "This is Deputy Calder, Gravesend Jurisdiction, requesting immediate Coast Guard response for suspected hazardous cargo and floodgate tampering at South Channel. Repeat, suspected sabotage and chemical hazard. I have video evidence." A pause, then a calm male voice answered. "Copy, Deputy. Stand by. Provide coordinates." Alara exhaled, a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The act of saying the truth out loud felt like breaking a curse. They didn't have long. By afternoon, the sky changed character. The clouds thickened into dark wool and the air tasted like pennies. The harbor fell strangely quiet, as if boats and birds had agreed to stop arguing. The storm glass in Alara's shack grew crowded with needle-like crystals that crawled up the sides. Noah stood by the window, fingers pressed to the pane. "The words are loud," he whispered. "They're shouting." Alara looked at him. "What do they say?" He swallowed. "Glass tied tonight. Security locks the road. Floodgate box has 2 keys. One is in his pocket." He winced as if the information hurt. "And they say, Alara, don't try to be a hero alone." Alara's mouth went dry. She had lived her whole adult life alone, fixing things alone, bearing loss alone. The idea that heroism could be a group effort felt both foreign and necessary. Maris returned with a grim set to her jaw. "Coast Guard cutter is inbound," she said. "But the mayor just posted an emergency notice. Rusk's security is assisting with storm preparation. They're closing the Ridge Road." Alara's mind snapped through options like a ratchet. The Ridge Road was the only paved route to the South Channel. If it closed, the Coast Guard would have to approach from the water, and in a surge, they would be delayed. "We go now," Alara said. Maris nodded. "We go now," she echoed, and for the first time Alara heard the relief beneath it. Relief that she did not have to be the only one who cared. They left before sunset, 3 figures in a truck that rattled with tools and courage. Noah sat between them, wrapped in his blue scarf, eyes darting between the windshield and the air. Wind hammered the trees, bending them toward the sea. At the first security checkpoint, men in gray jackets stood beside orange cones, like a barrier made of entitlement. One stepped forward, palm out. "Roads closed," he barked. Maris held up her badge. "Move the cones," she said. "Federal response is underway." The man's smile was thin. "Deputy, we're under the mayor's storm order," he replied. "Let's all be safe." Alara saw his right hand, the one not gesturing, rest near his jacket pocket. 2 keys hung from a ring clipped inside. Noah's words flashed in her mind. "One is in his pocket." Alara leaned across Noah and flicked the truck's headlights to high beam. The sudden glare washed the man's face in white. He flinched, reflexively lifting a hand. In that half-second, Maris opened her door and stepped out, moving with a speed born of training, not anger. She grabbed the man's wrist, twisted, and the key ring fell into her palm. The guard cursed and lunged, but Alara was already out of the truck, a tire iron in her hand like an extension of her will. She didn't swing. She only held it up, a statement. Behind her, Noah had slid out the other side and picked up a road flare from the truck bed. He struck it with trembling hands. Red light hissed to life, staining the fog crimson. The guard hesitated. Men behind him shifted. They expected compliance, not a small alliance that had decided to be inconvenient. Maris pointed her pistol at the ground, the gesture both restrained and firm. "Step back," she ordered. "I don't want anyone hurt. But I will not let you block a federal hazard response." The first guard spat on the pavement, then jerked his chin. The cones were dragged aside with exaggerated slowness. Alara drove through, heart pounding, while the men's faces faded behind them like bad memories. At the South Channel, the floodgate control station sat on stilts above a churn of water. Waves slapped the pilings with impatient hands. The metal box that housed the controls was padlocked, but the padlock had been replaced new, shiny, deliberate. "They already swapped it," Maris said. Noah stared at the box. "The words say 2 keys," he murmured. He looked toward the dark shape of the warehouse across the inlet, where floodlights glowed like eyes that refused to sleep. "The other key is in him," Noah said, voice shaking. "In Rusk." Alara's phone had no signal. The radio in the truck hissed uselessly. The storm pressed in, and the first heavy drops of rain struck the hood like thrown stones. Maris took a breath. "We can't wait for the cutter," she said. "If the surge hits and these gates don't open, the harbor will backflow, and anything leaking on those docks will ride the water straight into town." Alara felt the future narrowing like a funnel. She pictured the bulletin. Spill response delayed. Private security blocks access. 2 missing. 1 juvenile. She refused to let the juvenile be Noah. She refused to let the missing be anyone else she could still save. "Can you pick it?" Alara asked Maris, nodding at the padlock. Maris gave a humorless laugh. "I'm a deputy, not a magician." She looked at Noah. "Can you?" Noah's eyes widened. "I've never—" Alara reached into the truck and pulled out a small pouch of odd-shaped metal bits. Shims, tension wrenches, tiny screwdrivers. "My dad taught me to open stubborn things," she said. "Not doors, motors, crates, people who don't want to share." She handed the pouch to Noah. "If you can hear patterns in the static, you can hear patterns in metal." Noah's hands shook as he took the tools. He knelt before the lock, rain flattening his hair to his forehead. Alara crouched beside him, shielding him with her body as wind shoved at them. Maris stood watch, scanning the road, the water, the darkness. Noah slid a wrench into the keyway, breathed out, and began. The first attempt failed. The tool slipped and bit his finger. He sucked blood from the cut without a sound and tried again. Alara did not rush him. She knew that pressure was how you cracked glass. A second later, a faint click sounded, almost lost beneath thunder. Noah froze. Then he turned the wrench with deliberate care and the padlock sprang open. Maris exhaled sharply. "Kid," she said, astonished. Noah looked up, rain in his lashes. "The words weren't shouting that part," he whispered. "They were waiting." They opened the control box. Inside, wires had been cut and rejoined with sloppy haste. A small device, blinking green, was taped to the inner wall. A cheap timer rigged to send a surge of current at a set moment. Sabotage designed to fail the gates at the height of the storm. Alara ripped the device free. "Can we bypass it?" she yelled over the wind. Maris shook her head. "Not fast enough." Noah leaned in, eyes narrowing with sudden focus. "We can," he said, voice firm in a way Alara hadn't heard yet. He pointed to a junction where the clean factory wires met the hacked additions. "We cut here, we reroute here, and we ground it with the chassis." His fingers traced the path as if he could see the current. "It's simple. It's just someone being sloppy." Alara stared. "How do you know?" Noah swallowed. "Because I've watched him be sloppy for years," he said. And Alara understood. The boy had been trapped close enough to Rusk's machinery to learn its habits. He had been invisible, and invisibility had taught him everything. They worked with desperate precision. Alara held a flashlight. Maris used her knife to strip insulation. Noah twisted wires together, his small hands moving with calm intent. The rain thickened until the world became a curtain of water. The tide rose, lifting debris, slamming it into the pilings. When the last connection was made, Noah looked at Alara. "Now," he said. Maris pulled the manual lever. For a moment, nothing happened, and Alara's heart climbed into her throat. Then the gate mechanisms groaned like a waking beast, and the steel plates began to lift. Water roared through, redirected, spilling away from town. Alara laughed once, breathless, then choked as a new sound cut through the storm. Engines. 2 trucks barreled down the road, lights off, moving fast. Rusk's men. They'd realized the gate was being accessed. Mara stepped forward, gun up. "Stop!" she shouted. The wind tried to steal her voice. The trucks did not slow. Alara's mind flashed to the bulletin line. Don't let them film this. They were willing to run people down for silence. Noah grabbed the flare and threw it into the road. Red fire hissed and rolled, smoke blooming. The lead truck swerved, tires screaming on wet gravel, fishtailing toward the ditch. The second truck slammed brakes, skidding sideways. Men poured out, shouting, their words shredded by wind. Alara swung the truck door open and shouted back, not with rage, but with the authority of someone who had decided the story would not end here. "Coast Guard is coming!" she yelled. "Your boss's box is leaking poison." A man in a gray jacket laughed, harsh. "No proof," he shouted, and took a step forward. Noah stepped out from behind Alara, small but upright. "There is proof," he said. He lifted the laptop, which he had strapped in a plastic bag, and pointed it like a weapon of truth. "There are videos, dates, names, and I know where the spare drums are hidden." For a heartbeat, the men hesitated. Not because they cared, but because they calculated risk. Then one of them lunged toward Noah. Alara moved without thinking. She shoved Noah behind her and swung the tire iron not at the man's head, but at the truck's side mirror. Glass exploded. The sound was sharp, definitive, the kind of break that changed minds. "Come closer," she said, voice low and deadly calm. "And the only story you'll tell is the one where you got beaten by a woman in the rain." Maris's pistol remained steady. "Back up," she ordered again. The standoff might have tipped either way, but the sea chose that moment to add its vote. A massive wave surged into the channel, slamming the pilings, and the gate control station rocked. One of the men stumbled, caught his foot, and went down hard. Panic spread like spilled oil. Out on the black water, a searchlight cut through the storm. A cutter's horn bellowed, deep as judgment. The Coast Guard had arrived. Everything changed in the space of a breath. Men in gray jackets backed away, hands suddenly empty. Maris's radio crackled to life with an official voice requesting immediate compliance. The road that had belonged to Rusk's private rules now belonged to the law, at least for tonight. Coast Guard officers stormed the dock with clipped commands, boots splashing, flashlights slicing. They secured the floodgate station, took Maris's statement, and ordered the gray-jacketed men to stand aside. One officer, a woman with a hard braid and eyes that missed nothing, watched Noah with a careful look. "You're the juvenile from the call," she said. Noah nodded once. "You're safe now," the officer said. It sounded like a promise she had made to others and tried hard to keep. Alara felt her knees go weak with delayed fear. She sat on the wet gravel and let the rain run down her face, indistinguishable from tears. Noah sat beside her, shoulder touching hers, as if the contact anchored him. The spill response that the bulletin had predicted did not delay this time. Hazmat teams arrived before midnight. The drums in the warehouse were seized. The timer device was bagged as evidence. The hacked paperwork on the memory card became a chain of cause and culpability that led, inevitably, to Captain Rusk. Rusk himself tried to appear at dawn with lawyers and a smile, but the smile cracked when the braided officer showed him a warrant. He was escorted past the cameras he had always controlled, his face lit by flashes that did not ask permission. As he passed Alara, he leaned close enough that she could smell expensive cologne struggling against fear. "You think you've won," he hissed. Alara met his eyes. "I think you've been lying for so long you forgot the sea remembers," she said. Rusk's gaze slid to Noah. Something like recognition flickered there, then hatred. "You," he spat. "You were supposed to be quiet." Noah lifted his chin. "I tried," he said. "It didn't work." When the sun finally rose, it came pale and rinsed clean, as if the storm had scrubbed the sky with sand. Gravesend Spit woke to an unfamiliar sound. Sirens that meant help, not warning. People gathered at a distance, whispering. Some looked ashamed, some looked angry. Most looked afraid of how close they had come to disaster without noticing. The mayor held a press conference, and blamed outsiders and bad weather, but Maris stood behind him with her arms crossed, and the Coast Guard officers stood beside her, and the story refused to bend. The words on paper and the voices on record were stronger than the town's habit of looking away. In the weeks that followed, investigations widened. More containers were traced, more signatures surfaced. People who had never questioned Rusk's fences began to talk about lawsuits and sick children and strange smells at low tide. The spit did what it always did. It adjusted. Not kindly, not quickly, but with the stubbornness of land that did not want to drown. Noah stayed with Alara, officially this time. Social workers arrived with forms. Alara filled them out with hands that still smelled faintly of wire and rain. She was not a perfect guardian. She forgot to buy the right cereal. She swore when she shouldn't. She slept with a wrench under her pillow for a month. But she listened, and she stayed. The radio never spoke in that knife voice again. Sometimes it crackled, ordinary now, carrying weather updates and fishing reports. Yet on quiet evenings, when the sky held a clear blush over the water, Noah would pause and tilt his head as if hearing something distant. "Do you see the words?" Alara would ask. He would shake his head. "Not like before," he'd say. "Maybe they only show up when someone is about to drown." One night, months later, Alara found Noah in the yard staring at the storm glass jar. The crystals inside had settled into a soft, feathery pattern. "I used to think the future was a cage," he said. Alara leaned on the doorframe. "And now?" "Now I think it's a tide," Noah answered. "It comes in, it goes out. You can't stop it, but you can build things that don't break." Years passed. The salvage yard expanded into a small repair shop. Alara hired local kids who needed work and taught them how to fix what others threw away. Maris became sheriff after the mayor resigned under pressure, and the town, grudgingly, learned to respect a badge with a backbone. Noah grew taller, his voice deepening, his hands steady. He loved circuits the way other teenagers loved music. He built sensors from scrap, little boxes that could measure the salt in the air, the rise of the tide, the tiny shifts that warned of surge. He sent his designs to science fairs, then to universities, then to agencies that funded coastal resilience. He did not want revenge. He wanted prevention. That was his quiet rebellion against the story the words had tried to hand him. On the day he left for college, he wrapped the blue scarf around Alara's neck instead of his own. "So you remember," he said. Alara swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I won't forget," she said. Noah smiled, small and real. "You already proved that," he replied. After he drove away, Alara sat on the porch and watched the water until the horizon blurred. The sea looked calm, almost innocent. She knew better. She also knew, now, that innocence was not the point. Survival was, community was, truth was. That evening, the radio crackled once, a harmless burst of static, then fell silent. Alara reached for the dial out of habit, then stopped and simply listened to the quiet. The future did not announce itself. It never had. People announced it, in the choices they made when storms arrived and when children washed up. In the dark, the storm glass caught the porch light and glimmered like a held breath, clear and steady, no longer a warning, but a reminder that even glass can survive the tide if you keep it from shattering.